I suppose it's time that I get down to what this series is really about. I gave you a lot of background so far. I got out of law school, started up a practice in Boulder, Colorado, because there was a university there. I still hoped to do research and teach at a university in spite of the Vietnam War lack of funding. In any event, I viewed myself primarily as a criminologist and still do. And I got this call one day from a fellow who was referred by my aunt in Palm Springs. He had been a gambler. He was a World War II bombardier. Had been arrested several times and been around the block several times. And he was being rousted in Littleton. I got him out of the problem there. And he told me he had an appeal going on a Travel Act violation with another guy named Mike Paladino. And he already had counsel for the appeal, but he wondered if I might represent Mr. Paladino on the appeal. Well, he was the regional head of a group called the Italian American Civil Rights League. So when I interviewed Mr. Paladino, he asked if I would represent the league too, and I told him that I would, as long as I didn't have to jeopardize my license or do anything that would do so, and as long as I could study them. And they said that was cool, as long as I published the truth, which started me on a long, winding road linking organized crime, power elite in this country, and the CIA, to the point I couldn't tell the difference after a while. So anyway, the Baldino case was kind of interesting. The Court of Appeals said in their opinion that the travel of Mr. Bridwell and Paladino to Nebraska for their crap game was another foray into the countryside to fleece the lambs of the land. It was kind of a colorful opinion. The problem with it is after that the Leary case came down finally. But the real problem with Paladino and Bridwell was that they had gaming licenses, and they used the gaming licenses to show that their status was that of gamblers. And the Travel Act said it was illegal for somebody who was a professional gambler to travel in aid of racketeering enterprise. Gambling was one of the racketeering enterprises. I think the Leary precedent may have overlooked that or reversed that. And anyway, that started my adventures off in that area. I got to meet Joe Colombo, who was the president of the league, and about a year later he was shot. But through this connection, I got some really, really interesting cases and got some really interesting information. The reason I started out with the Paladino case is I got a call about a month ago from his daughter, and I never realized he had a daughter, but she was born in Canada, and her mother was a member of the Canadian Intelligence Services, probably translations branch, but I'm not real certain there. I've had some cases involving these people, and they're probably a little more straightforward than the CIA that I've dealt with here in this country. In any event, Paul Dino's daughter called me and wanted to know about her father. Naturally, she was just researching him, and told me about her mother, who had been a spook. Now, just a year ago, I ran across some information where Mr. Paul Dino and others worked for Jack Ruby. And that was when Jack Ruby worked for Army Intelligence. And these guys were running guns to both Batista and Castro for Mr. Ruby out of Texas. They were also bringing drugs in armored cars in order to pay for the guns. It was one of the first CIA operations I ran into. But it was curious it was run out of Dallas. And it's curious how the guns and drugs motif runs through the various investigations of the Kennedy assassination, Meyer Lansky, Santos Trafficante, Carlos Marcello, and all of those guys that I've run across in my career. So, what we do know is that Paul Dino had a wife who gave him a child, and the wife was somehow connected with the intelligence community through Canada. Now, what I'm going to establish for the next maybe year and a half is the extensive connections between organized crime, organized labor, and the intelligence agencies, as well as control of the press. I can document most of this, and what I plan to do is document it in my Dennis Comments blog, because I don't know how to work this video machine showing pictures of things and integrating the two, but hopefully somebody will show me someday. So anyway, when I took on Mr. Paul Dino's appeal, it was to the Court of Appeals and then later to the U.S. Supreme Court. I learned a lot of things about the structure of the legal profession in Denver, who was who, and it seemed to me that it was a very tight-knit group that defended the Italian Americans in Denver. A fascinating group, by the way. So, I took a note from Mr. Paul Dino for his fees and secured it with his ice cream shop. Now, the ice cream shop is going to become very important, newsworthy a little bit later on. It was a quiet investment when I took it, but it rapidly changed. There was a famous shootout there between the Smaldone family and the Paul Dino faction, and a few things like that involving what they called a young Turk. Now, what happened there is this young Turk, his name was Joey Nucci, had borrowed a diamond from Checkers Smaldone and didn't want to give it back. So they had a meeting at the creamery, and present were Tony Ciccarelli, Paul Dino, Smaldone, Joe the Ram Salardino, and a few other lookers on. So there was a confrontation, and Nucci said to Smaldone, "You're through in this town." and he drew a gun on him. He pulled the trigger on the gun and it clicked. Smaldone fainted. Ciccarelli grabbed Nucci's glasses that were cataract glasses, did a jig on him, so he's out there. Salardino is out there looking for his glasses and things like that. It's a Keystone Cops thing. Everybody was panicking, running around. There was a clicking of the gun with no bullet shots. The problem with the gun is it was a rimfire pistol and had center fire bullets in it, or vice versa. Anyway, the bullets didn't work. So finally, Smaldone gets his gun out and he shoots Nucci, hits a button in the chest, the bullet goes around the chest, and everybody loads Nucci into the car to take him to the hospital. While he was at the hospital, detectives came in there and said that, Nucci, this could be very serious. Obviously, your boss doesn't like you. And Nucci said, well, he took me to the hospital. What am I supposed to think about that? And the police kept working on him. Anyway, they got Nucci to agree to be a cooperating witness. And one of the tactics that they used is they said, well, Mr. Nucci, if you don't cooperate with us, we're going to tell everybody that you did, and then we're going to revoke a bail and stick you back into the jail and put you on the third tier and see how long you can survive up there before you go off the balcony. So that kind of convinced Nucci there to be a cooperating witness. So they wanted hard evidence about some criminal activity. Well, Nucci didn't really have that much hard evidence that he wanted to give against Smaldone, but he had some against some of the other people that he hung out with, namely Baldino, Ciccarelli, and people like that. So what he ended up testifying to, or getting involved in, or ratting off his fellow criminals, whatever you want to call them, was that there was a burglary excuse me, at a warehouse in Denver. And the warehouse had a burglary every year. Around January, they take inventory of all the warehouses in Colorado, and they have what they call an inventory tax, and you pay a tax on the inventory. Well, this company miraculously had burglaries every year about a month before the inventory, and they could had a great shrinkage because of theft. This particular year, the warehouse, which had got immunity because they weren't Italians, I think, got immunity, and they were to have proceeded against burglars that were hired by them to burglarize the warehouse to explain inventory shortages and things like this. So collect on insurance and avoid taxes both. And they'd done this for 10 years at least. So it goes to trial. And it was kind of a fun trial, actually. And one of the things we discovered during the trial was that some agency had planted bugs in the judge's chambers, and we discovered them. They were trying to see what we were doing, or how we were doing the case, because it was a highly publicized so-called mafia case. And while the jury was out, one of the alternate jurors came up to us, two of us, and said, "Which one of your clients is the godfather?" And I looked at the juror and I said, "Well, which one do you think?" She said, "Well, I think it's your client. You talk the most. And he was the most distinguished. He had silver hair. They called him the Silver Fox." Unfortunately, that wasn't the case, but that's what the juror said. So another attorney that was standing there said, "Well, why are you asking this question?" And she said, "Well, we talked about this every time there was a recess." And he said, "You talked about the case during recess, and you talked about who was who." And she said, "Yeah, everybody knew it was a mafia case. And you guys were a little better than most lawyers we've seen." So that's one of the things that impacted our opinion. But essentially, they look like they're mafia, and the charge looks like a mafia charge. And I said, well, this other lawyer said to her, "Would you tell that story to the judge?" And she said, "Well, of course I will." Now, the thing of it is, these jurors were admonished right from the get-go not to discuss the case during recess, not to discuss the case among themselves until the jury was convened to deliberate. They rapidly violated this. So it ended after 6 days of trial in a mistrial, which means we all had to start all over. Now, next door was another case, and this was interesting. It was a murder case, and the public defender's office had just started a murder specialty group within the public defender's office. And Dave Mander was one of the lawyers involved, and I can't remember the name of the other one. Anyway, they were to have had this murder trial, but they hadn't even really talked to their defendant. They hadn't prepared. And the day the trial was to have started, Dave Mander went in there and asked for a continuance. And the judge says, "Well, you don't get a continuance. You guys are murder specialists. You don't need one. Try the damn case." And they said, well, they were unprepared. They hadn't had discovery, things like that. The judge said, "Well, go ahead and pick a jury anyway." So they started picking the jury, and the jury selection sort of went like this. "Well, Mr. Juror, do you think you can be fair in this case? I really haven't read much about the case and don't know much about it, and I don't know any other questions to ask, but will you be fair?" And of course the jurors said yes. And they selected 12 jurors in the morning before anything else got started. So the trial started, and the government called its first witness, and the defense attorney said, "Well, I don't know what this case is about. I have to read the discovery here," and spent a half an hour reading through the offense report from this one witness. And then after doing that, said to the witness, "I have no questions," and sat down. The same thing happened with the next witness. You could see the judge fuming on the bench because these guys were making a hell of a record for ineffective assistance of counsel. And he didn't want to have the trial, have to declare a mistrial or anything like that. So about half an hour before lunch, the state public defender, their boss, showed up to watch some of the trial. And after one witness was presented, the judge called a recess for lunch. And the state public defender took the deputy defenders out to lunch. And after a 2-hour lunch, the Judge reconvenes the court, has a great smile on his face, and he says, now are you guys ready to proceed with this trial? And one of the public defenders gets up and says, no, Your Honor, we just been fired from the public defender's office. We no longer work for them, so we no longer are going to be involved in this trial. And the judge says, you're going to proceed with the trial. And just because you're fired doesn't mean you can get out of your attorney-client relationship. So they still proceeded with making the ineffective assistance of counsel record. And finally, there was a writ of prohibition filed, I believe, that stopped the trial. And that was the end of the two murder specialists in the public defender's office. It was an interesting time at that time. So in the same building with two different really hot trials going on, we had sort of ineffective assistance of counseling. We had a judge that was showing that he could move his docket along no matter what, or what the cost to justice. We had another incident where there was organized crime allegations in a case, and they bugged the judge's chambers. So it was really the Wild West back in the 70s when they first decided to bring the mafia to light in the papers. Now, one of the really interesting things about all of this was that I had two clients, Mrs. Tannenbaum and Professor Rhea, and one got accused of causing the other's disappearance. Both of them worked for intelligence agencies of the U.S. government. Both of them hit the New York Times newspaper and was front page news for quite some time. And every so often there's books written about these two, and investigations, more investigations, etc. Rhea disappeared. Tannenbaum got accused of causing his disappearance. The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence stated that this case caused a breach of liaison between the CIA and the FBI. Now, I have files showing correspondence between Richard Helms and J. Edgar Hoover. For anybody that's interested, I'd have to dig them out, but they exist. And what happened is they tried Mrs. Tannenbaum for ripping off Rhea's estate, and she was found not guilty by reason of insanity. So the government went to a prosecutor in Denver, Mike McKevitt, and wanted him to re-prosecute and get a different verdict. And the visitation was from two FBI agents and a CIA agent from the Denver office, which wasn't supposed to exist. Now, coincidentally, only I don't think it's coincidentally, right after Mike McKevitt overruled the district court judge in Boulder and went ahead and tried Mrs. Tannenbaum again for the same offense, and he got her committed to the state hospital. McKevitt quit his job as district attorney and ran for Congress. And while in Congress, he was a one-term congressman. He lobbied for organized crime funds for Denver. The problem earlier is Denver could not establish that it had sufficient organized crime membership to get any grants. So he spent his time in Congress lobbying for money for Denver to fight organized crime. And while there, he published an organized crime manual listing everybody's name that ended in a vowel in this book. calling it the Denver Mafia or Organized Crime Handbook. At that time, then, I started representing the Italian American Civil Rights League, and Paul Dino got arrested for having possession of one of these books. And well, that's another story, but it's funny as hell. The really coincidental thing is that when they got Tannenbaum and Rhea out of the way, McKevitt got funding to fight organized crime in Denver, and we had all these organized crime trials, and a lot of publicity. I couldn't complain. I got a lot of publicity from those trials, but so did the city and county of Denver and the Denver DA's office. So it's always bothered me that this happened and that McKevitt was a one-termer, and he did that. Now, the manual consisted of any mugshots of anybody arrested with an Italian-sounding name, most of them from North High School. Some of them were high school athletes, some of them went to University of Colorado and various other colleges as football and basketball players. And it was really kind of slanderous to do that. And we fought like hell to stop it, and finally got it stopped. But it was all about money, all about grants, all about getting publicity for fighting organized crime. But to fight organized crime, you had to create organized crime in the first place. And there's another incident that I was involved in involving a guy named Pody Poe, and they wrote a book about how they turned him into a mafiosa and a bookmaker and all this kind of stuff. And if you'll excuse me a minute, I'll try to look for that book to show you the front. Well, I'll have to do it another time. So, they arrest Paul Dino for purloining a classified public document, although Colorado had no means of classifying anything. They try him, and the testimony is that there were 10,000 copies made, each one numbered and passed out to law enforcement and judiciary people, and there was a record of each number. And they wanted to know what Paul Dino's number was to see who the cop was that gave it to him. Now, on cross-examination, it came out that there were 20,000 copies of this manual, when only 10,000 were numbered. The other 10,000 Mr. McKevitt used for political purposes to lobby and things like that. So it wasn't really clear how my client got the book, but it could have been one of those other copies. But an interesting thing happened during the cross-examination of the police officer involved. His name was Don Molnix. And I had a copy, Mr. Paul Dino's copy of the book, of the manual. I also had a textbook that I'd used when I was in graduate school in criminology, written by Sutherland and Cressy. And the Sutherland and Cressy were part of the criminology textbook, were the introduction of the organized crime manual, lifted right out of the textbook. So I get Molnix on the stand and I said, look, I'm going to read part of this book to you, and you read the next paragraph. We're going to go back and forth for a while. And he did. And I read a paragraph. He read a paragraph. I read a paragraph. He read a paragraph. The prosecutor jumps up and said, "What's the point of this? You're both reading out of that." And I said, "No, Your Honor, I'm reading from Sutherland and Cressy's 4th edition of Criminology, which is the same as the beginning of the Organized Crime Manual." And I said, "The only crime that's been committed here thus far that I can see is plagiarism, where they're plagiarizing Sutherland and Cressy's textbook." Well, at that point, the judge asked a few questions and then dismissed the case. So that was one of my first organized crime wins. I had many more after that. I would like to get some feedback on this part before I continue. It's going to be very complicated. It's going to have all kinds of evidence, statements that you may or may not believe, statements that I can back up and prove are true. But I don't want to go that far out on a limb if nobody gives a shit. So please give me some feedback, and we'll start. Thank you very much. Have a good week.